Ithaca presents Going Mainstream, written by Julia Ebner and read by Emily Pennant-Rea. Preface. When I first started researching extremist tendencies in 2015, we lived in a very different world. Back then, most government and security representatives I spoke to agreed with me on the dangers that could stem from political violence and terrorism. But few believed that the radical fringes of society would attain any real political relevance in their lifetime. They could plot attacks and pose a risk to national security, that much was clear. But how would they be able to mobilize masses behind their ideas? The votes in favour of Brexit and Trump fundamentally changed this assessment. Still, most liberal progressive policymakers I briefed were convinced that the outcomes of both the EU referendum and the 2016 US election were populist breakthroughs that happened under exceptional circumstances, political accidents that were unlikely to turn into a wider pattern. We would return to the old normal soon. But over the last few years, I have been able to observe, often in real time from within radical movements, some of the most obscure ideas and extreme conspiracy myths making their way into popular consciousness. The mainstreaming of these ideas has been fed by, and in turn feeds, a wider erosion of the political middle ground in recent decades. Confronted with heightened demand for drastic change, political parties have needed to reinvent themselves. In the UK and the US, the Tories and Republicans have eschewed caution in favour of populist nationalism, which has likewise been a rising force in the Australian Liberals. The dynamics in these English-speaking countries echo those in nations like Hungary, Poland and Austria, where parties that originally represented mainstream conservatism have gradually embraced radically illiberal, ultra-nationalist ideas. In other countries, centrist parties have responded to rising competition from the far right by forming coalitions with the more extreme players. The election victories of the neo-fascist parties Sweden Democrats and Brothers of Italy in 2022 demonstrate the outright success of the radical right. How precisely have the most radical fringes managed to conquer the political middle and influence once centrist parties? The people I encountered in the field while researching this book were not all from the traditional far right. Many of them came from left-wing or even apolitical backgrounds. Some were just concerned citizens and parents. Historically, in Europe and North America, extremist movements have been defined by specific tactics, ideological traits, and hierarchical structures. But today we are faced with a new reality. Extremists hold blurred ideologies, form surprising coalitions, and use loose post-organizational structures. This has made them less predictable than ever before. In all my investigations for this book, I discovered a clear pattern to the mainstreaming process of radical ideas. Whether we look at incels, White Lives Matter activists, or QAnon, these movements all started off as fringe subcultures that had little impact on the wider public discourse. It was when they began to create powerful international networks and managed to build their own alternative media ecosystems that they started to become influential. They gradually changed public attitudes and fueled a hostile societal backlash against progressive movements. As the Overton window, the window of acceptable discourse, moved in their favour, this paved the way for the mass adoption of extreme ideas. The last stage is characterised by violent escalations of liberal versus illiberal visions of the future, what I will call proxy culture wars. As extreme voices grow louder in parliaments, street protests and online debates, our society is becoming increasingly fractured. We are seeing a rise of hyper-polarised communities along the dividing lines of racial justice, gender equality, queer rights, climate activism and vaccine acceptance. But today's polarisation is not just the product of competing ideologies. These conflicts are deeply entrenched in people's identities. Opposing groups hold differing views not simply of the world, but of
Sample complete. Ready to continue?